to the last lecture in Bio 110 Systematics. I congratulate every one of you who has reached this final chapter. So today we're going to look at systematics and conservation biology. Now to start this off, let's look at the outline of our lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to look at the role of systematics in conservation biology. And in order to arrive to this topic, in order to answer how can systematics help design a good model for conservation, we will first try to define what conservation biology is. So under this topic, we are going to try to differentiate between the concept of preservation and conservation, because we always hear the word preservation whenever we talk about environmental protection. Okay? Here we're going to not only look at the idea of preservation and compare it with conservation, but we will also try to explore the ethical foundations under conservation. Okay, so you have there the land ethic and the environmental ethic. Okay, and then that will lead us to the definition of conservation biology. Okay, and of course, modern views of conservation biology. And in line with this, continuing with the story, we're going to look at conservation as a crisis discipline. This was termed by Michael Solé. It was introduced by Michael Solé as a crisis discipline. And why is that? Okay, we're going to explore on that. And finally, when we have looked at the multidisciplinary approach in conservation, we can now try to tackle the role of systematics in conservation. Okay? So under this, of course, you expect that we are going to recall the definition of systematics. Okay? And then we are going to look at the Philippine setting. Okay? The Philippines as an archipelago, and then why there are a lot of endemic species here. Okay? We are also going to tackle the biodiversity here in the Philippines. And finally, we're going to look at ways moving forward, and that is through discussing climate change adaptation and where systematics would fall into place in all of this. Okay? So let's head into the lecture. Okay? So first, we're going to look at what conservation biology is. And in order to arrive at that, we will try to differentiate it between the concept of preservation. Yan. So what is the difference between preservation and conservation? Do you have any initial ideas? Yan. So there's actually a big difference between the two. So according to Schultes and Hefner in 2016 in their article, they begin this notion, okay, a very much ignored notion, wherein we automatically equate human presence to the destruction of nature. Okay, so in the idea of preservation, we have an exclusionary model. Ibig sabihin, ine-exclude natin yung presence ng humans. Okay, so this is what was used to argue the removal of technology from natural areas. Okay, hands off pristine wilderness. Okay, so we can only enjoy nature kapag walang tao na involved, walang urbanization, walang development. So we have to leave it now untouched. Okay, and this is because of that notion, as pointed out by Schultes and Hefner, wherein we automatically equate nga human presence with the destruction of nature. And if we try to remember, diba, sa mga parks natin, we usually see signs like keep off the grass or do not pick flowers. Ayan. So, we usually encounter these signs in parks. Ayan. And according to Schultes and Hefner, the first national parks were actually built on this exclusionary model, on preservation, on the idea of preservation. So, these parks, these protected areas, they were first built on that preservation model. With this belief na kailangan meron tayong separate place for urbanization and separate place that is protected from urbanization. Okay? And this is to protect these areas from our nature daw to destroy. Okay? From our extractive activities. Ayan. And these activities somehow endanger these areas. So, these parks now, this became the solution of our society, allegedly, to experience nature without destroying it. Kasi nga, wherever man is, di ba, nasisira daw ang nature. And this is quite reflective in the U.S. Wilderness Act, okay, of 1964. Ayan. So, in the U.S. Wilderness Act of 1964, it says that in contrast with the areas, okay, na nagdo-dominate ang mga gawa ng tao, wherein ito na yung cities, ito na yung urbanized landscape, ito na yung towns, okay, these areas are hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Okay? Ayan. And in all these articles that I've encountered, as well as in masters, this idea of wilderness, okay, this concept of wilderness has much been created by colonizers. Okay? Kasi in pre-colonial times, okay, in our indigenous communities even, wala namang ganitong concept because we have always been integrated in nature. Ayan. And this is where conservation actually comes in. Okay? So in conservation, we have the idea of being included. Ayan. So, in contrast with the preservation model, our concept of conservation is an inclusionary model. Okay? So, this entails that we are still a part of nature, wherein we use these resources found in nature, but sustainably. Okay? So, this is actually grounded in subsistence living that is very much done or practiced by indigenous communities before, okay, when values were much different than now. Okay, so what does it mean when we live sustainably? Okay, you use everything na kapag kumuha kayo, pakonti-konti lang, only what you need. Okay, that is what is meant when we say subsistence living. Okay, you take only what you need. You take only what is necessary. And this is how you live sustainably. Wag sobra-sobra. And when you take, i-optimize mo yun. Gamitin mo siya ng buong-buo. What does that mean? So, for example, you have a prey, you capture the prey, and hindi lang siya for meat. Hindi lang siya para sa pagkain. So, you can use its hide, okay, yung fur niya, yung skin niya, you can use it for clothing. Siguro, you can use it as a rug. Okay, yung bones niya, you can use it as for other things, for other needs. Okay, so gamitin mo siya ng buong buo. And do not take more than what you need. Okay, and that is where conservation has been built. We use resources still, but sustainably. Okay, and this inclusionary model should provide a way for community development pa rin. So, ibig sabihin, nagde-develop yung community na nandun sa place na yon. Okay? And you develop now this shared ownership because you are much involved in managing the resources. So, ito yung ideal na conservation. Okay? So, this concept of conservation, of course, presently, it is deeply rooted in the loss of biodiversity. But before we got to that stage, before we got here, the idea of conservation was built on a utilitarian ethic. Okay, so ibig sabihin, usage pa rin. It is on our benefit pa rin. So we use natural resources and we try to conserve them for the benefit of those who are here now. Okay, we don't have this idea of having things the same as they are now for the future generation, okay? Or better pa na kung ano yung datnan natin. So we don't have that concept yet of intergenerativity wherein we have a notion of having something for the future generation para sa mga anak ng anak natin to use. So wala pa yung concept na yun before. This principle of conservation was successful because of its utilitarian ethic before, okay? Or the use, again, of natural resources and their sustainable use, for the benefit of those who are here right now, okay? Ayan. This concept of conservation this movement actually began even before the Industrial Revolution. Okay? It started with the work of John Evelyn. Okay? So in 1662, John Evelyn presented a work that entailed the conservation, okay, the protection of the existing forests in England. Okay? So he was tasked by the reigning monarchy at that time to try to look into the depletion of resources kasi gumagawa sila ng ships, ayan, ng mga bahay, and they use so much trees. And now, in 1662, ayan, so meron na siyang nagawang research, and as a result, it called for the protection of the existing forests, okay? And then he also went further to say that for every tree that is cut, one should plant a new one. Okay? So this was presented to the Royal Society in 1662 and it was very much successful. This movement was very much successful, but it was more geared towards preventing yung depletion of natural resources. So the concept of biodiversity, of climate change, of ecology, these were actually least of its priorities pa lang noon. So before we arrive to these neoliberal views of conservation and conservation, this movement began, okay, as a way to limit the loss of natural resources, to prevent the depletion, yung tuluyang pagkawala ng mga kailangan natin mula sa nature. So it had this utilitarian ethic before. Yan. And actually, 'di ba, this utilitarian ethic is quite persuasive. 'Di ba? It's quite persuasive. It entices policymakers, government officials, even now, 'di ba? When we try to present the potential of conservation for food production, for food security, for tourism, 'di ba? For livelihood development. And there is a danger in that. Why? Because what happens now? We protect an area for the benefit only of these highly commercialized species. Okay? We protect an area for its economic potential. Yun. So, dun na nagkakaroon ng imbalance. Okay? Or disproportionate na efforts. Okay? Ayan. So, it is persuasive to those not already committed to conservation. And unfortunately, this utilitarian ethic can still be seen until now. Okay? Kasi, well, yun yung foundations dati. So, according to Scandrani, what then? Diba? What then should we preserve or conserve? Diba? Ano yung dapat nating isave? Because what we conserve, the things that we protect, would be a reflection of what we value. Diba? And Scandrani has a point. We say, let's protect X, Y, and Z so that we can have a steadier supply of X, Y, and Z. And so essentially, we commodify them too. Okay? Essentially, nagiging literal na money does grow on trees. Kasi yung mga bagay na to, we protect them with their future use in mind. Kasi they will benefit us. Okay? And why should we be the ones to decide which to preserve, which to conserve, and which to protect? Diba? Ayan. So, I pose now the question then. Are protected areas now the answer to conservation, if that's the case? Diba? Or are they just these means for us to abuse power, abuse technological advantage over the locals in that area, over the indigenous peoples in that area? Okay? Because now this concept of wilderness, diba? This concept of wilderness, of preservation, of exclusion, became now the justification to remove indigenous communities. Okay? Why? Bakit hindi sila na konsensya? It is essentially a type of genocide as well, diba? Pero they weren't that conscious of it. They weren't that, how would they call it? Remorseful of it, because indigenous communities were essentially seen as less human. They were savages. And so they can easily be eliminated, displaced from their own lands. And most of these protected areas are found in ancestral domains because these have the highest levels of biodiversity. Very much diverse, very much productive yung mga places na to. And now, when we look at that, okay, according to Linda Tuhiwai Smith, okay, in her book, The Colonizing Methodologies, these indigenous peoples kasi, they reflect this unfinished business of colonization as seen by colonizers. Itong minority lands, okay, these were their final destination. Ito na yung final na sana na isama nila sa mga dapat na colonize nila. They were the final frontier for colonial venture. Okay? And unfortunately, even if indigenous communities were able to effectively resist Western colonization, they lost their political independence nung naitatag na yung Republika ng Pilipinas. Okay? Why? Because these lands, they became government-owned. Okay? Pagmamayari na to ng gobyerno, and they were open to logging kasi nga very much productive yung place, to logging, to mining, plantation concessions, and these were all granted by the government to not only national communities but multinational companies. Okay? National companies and multinational companies. Okay? And so now this discipline that's supposed to be devoted to fighting destruction becomes in itself a driver of destruction because we use now this justification, okay, na yung wilderness concept na to as justification to remove indigenous communities. And if we have that utilitarian ethic in our pockets, okay, in our heads, then of course, lalo pang mako-commodify. Kaya nga din siya inopen for logging, mining, etc. Because it's very much usable. Okay? Ayan. And meron tayong utilitarian ethics. So we use them now as an excuse to abuse power, di ba? Abuse technological advantage. Ayan. So, in a study done by Shiyo Segi in 2014. He went to Cebu Island, okay, and he studied a marine protected area there. He tried to look at the power dynamics, socio-economic dynamics as well in that area, wherein a marine protected area was established, okay? And here, he looked at the economic impacts of marine protected areas or MPAs in the fishing communities there. So, like I said, the idea of a protected area is enticing to both government officials and conservation biologists because it tries to address these key problems: environmental degradation and underdevelopment. Okay? And that's what the governments there had in mind as well. So they had visions that were more geared as well to tourism and livelihood. And this is a bit dangerous because now we have conservation projects that can give us economic development. Okay, so we begin to use it for our own good, for our benefit, not already just for the benefit of the ecosystems that we wish to protect. Okay, so it gives us this economic development and we leave now political power unchecked. Okay, so this supposedly win-win situation na magkakaroon ng less environmental degradation and better community development, hindi na nangyayari. Because instead of conserving and protecting the environment while having food security, okay, economic development, it becomes now a driver of social inequality. Okay? And tumataas lalo yung poverty. Why? Kasi small-scale fishers usually lose fishing grounds. Kasi nga ipoprotect yung area na yon. So there will be no-take zones in protected areas. And then, what happens now is yung benefits from that, yung productivity from these no-take zones, from these tourist attractions, then goes to people in power now. Okay? And yun yung inaral ni Shiyo Segi na talaga bang nagkakaroon ng win-win situation? Ibig sabihin, conservationists get to protect the environment and then the government gets to develop the area. Okay? So, ano yung implications nun sa mga nandun, nasa ground talaga, yung mga talagang naaapektuhan? Okay, those whose livelihood is embedded in the area. What are the implications for them? Okay, and this is what Shiyo Segi tried to look at. And sadly, unfortunately, hindi nangyayari yun. Kasi yun nga, hindi pa masyadong pinag-aaralan yung power dynamics sa mga marine protected areas, sa mga protected areas na ito. And Scandrani, I like what Scandrani said na having ecological theory, being knowledgeable of this ecological theory, cannot assure us to have ethical counsel from them. Okay? Even if we know so much knowledge, okay, ecological knowledge, hindi ibig sabihin nun na ethically sound na yung mga decisions natin. Okay? Involving people in the conservation process, according to Scandrani, means more than informing them the right way of doing conservation. Okay? It's more than that. It means abandoning this notion, hegemonic attitude yung tinerm nila. Ibig sabihin, we have this taking of a colonizer type of attitude. Kasi tayo yung nakakaalam ng science. Okay? Now we see ourselves as superior to the people there, to the people who are really impacted by the changes, okay, by environmental degradation, by biodiversity loss. We see it na lang as a scientific question, 'di ba? Na kakailanganin ng science in order for others to understand. At dahil alam natin yung science behind it, mas superior na tayo kesa mga nandun. And that is a hegemonic attitude, okay? In looking at conservation. Kasi as scientists, we cannot continue to act as if we are the only ones na knowledgeable about nature. Okay? Just like how colonizers have this notion din na indigenous communities, pre-colonial communities are savages. Ayun. And without them, hindi magkakaroon ng development. Diba? We have to abandon this kind of thinking na dahil alam natin yung science behind it, tayo lang yung knowledgeable about it. And this is rooted from living apart from nature. Ayan. So, dahil ito sa highly urbanized living natin, na we need science pa to be able to understand what's happening in our environment. Kasi hindi tayo naging parte. We weren't able to live with it. Okay? Hindi tayo observant sa mga nangyayaring changes sa paligid natin. Okay? When one species is lost, we don't really feel the effect of it. Unlike if we really lived there or we lived as a part of nature. Yun. So it's just this cycle now, 'di ba? Na we live apart from nature, we look to science to explain these changes, and we act more superior na to those who are actually living in it. And then we try to convince everyone that we need science to be able to explain everything that's happening. Okay? And so, Shiosegi, di ba? He did nga this study in Cebu Island. He or she, I'm not sure with the gender of Shiosegi, but Segi boldly states that these solutions that are technocratic in nature, okay, ibig sabihin, only the experts in that field can understand it. It only marginalizes and alienates these fisher folk more, these small-scale fishers, these people who are actually living in that area. Okay? And so, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, and I think I highly recommend this for everyone, especially scientists, okay? Because she targets yung mga ways natin of going to communities, going to these areas to conduct research, okay? And she has a bold statement as well, the academe and the scientific body. Okay, she says that researchers, we enter communities armed with goodwill in our front pockets and then patents in our back pockets. Okay, we bring medicine into villages and then extract blood for genetic analysis. And it's such a good statement. Diba? Sabi niya pa, no matter how appalling these behaviors are, we will always try to justify these intentions for the good of mankind. Diba? For science's sake. For progress. Okay? And now, the means are justified by the ends. Okay? And that's a sad way to do things. It's an injustice, okay, to the people there, to the communities living there, both the ecosystem and the social systems there. Ayun. So, I then pose this question. Is this ethical? Yung pag-conduct ba ng ganito ay ethical? So in 1987, Aldo Leopold published this article and it is entitled The Land Ethic. And according to Aldo Leopold, ang ethic, okay, it originates from our desire, our tendency, okay, as interdependent individuals to develop these ways to cooperate. Yan. So, may dash, cooperate. For us to be able to operate with each other. Okay, this is the origin of an ethic. Okay, it is from our tendency or desire to be able to cooperate. So, kailangan nating i-accept na interdependent tayo. Kailangan natin yung isa't isa. And so, we developed an ethic. Ecologically, this is reflected by having this limitation of existence. Okay? Limitation of our freedom to do anything we want, to take anything we want. For the sake of survival, for the sake of existence. And philosophically naman, we try to deviate from antisocial behavior and choose social behavior. Okay? So, whether it is ecologically or philosophically, an ethic works on that, on those instincts, okay? On the presence of our instincts to be part of a community, of an interdependent community that can cooperate with its members. Okay? Ayan. Kasi naiintindihan natin na we are all interdependent of each other, with each other. Okay? So, dun naka-ground ang isang ethic. Ayan. And, ayun nga, sabi niya nga, we are not just owners, but members. And what does that imply? Okay, so kapag you have this idea of integration as opposed to ownership, yan, so being a part of it, not just being the owner of it, we begin to look at things not as privileges but as responsibilities now. We are responsible. We are accountable for the changes because parte tayo nung system na yon. And that is a very good way of shifting our perspective. Diba? Hindi tayo, ang relationship natin sa land and all that is in it is not just economic. Okay? We are now integrated rather than an owner, diba? A conqueror, sabi niya. And we have responsibilities, not privileges. Okay? So, hindi tayo entitled. We don't act entitled. Yan. Another one would be the environmental ethic. And this was introduced naman by Edward Wilson, in his book, The Diversity of Life. Ayan. And sabi niya, something that I can't give justice, okay, by rewording. So, I will read instead. Sabi ni E.O. Wilson, humanity co-evolved with the rest of life in this particular planet. Other worlds are not in our genes. Because scientists have yet to put names on most kinds of organisms, and because they entertain only a vague idea of how ecosystems work, it is reckless to suppose that biodiversity can be diminished indefinitely without threatening humanity itself. Field studies show that as biodiversity is reduced, so is the quality of the services provided by ecosystems. These services are important to human welfare, but they cannot form the whole foundation of an enduring environmental ethic. If a price can be put on something, that something can be devalued, sold, and discarded. Tama nga naman siya, di ba? Leopold further says, a land ethic cannot prevent alteration, management, and use of these resources, but it often does affirm their right to continued existence in a natural state. Okay? So yes, ethics cannot prevent yung actions natin, yung decisions natin of how to manage them, but it affirms na they have to continue existing because of their intrinsic value. And finally, for this slide, I would like to pose the question of Skandrani again in his article in 2016. Do we want to practice science based on ethical considerations, or should our ethics be dictated by science? So now we go to the concept of conservation biology. Ayan. So conservation biology was coined by Michael Soleil in 1985. Okay? So he says that conservation biology addresses the biology of species, communities, and ecosystems that are perturbed, either directly or indirectly, by human activities or other agents. Its goal is to provide principles and tools for preserving biological diversity. Okay? So this means that conservation biology is very much anchored in several postulates. Okay? First is that diversity of organisms is good. Okay? So the more diverse a place is, the better. Another would be ecological complexity is good. Okay? Ibig sabihin maraming ecological systems na involved. You have your marine, you have your terrestrial, okay? Evolution is good, that's number 3. So, ibig sabihin change over time, that's good, okay? Natural selection as well, di ba? And the fourth is biotic diversity has intrinsic value, okay? So, these are the 4 postulates where conservation biology is grounded upon, according to Michael Soleil in 1985. Okay? So, at a population level, sabi niya, the important processes are actually genetic and evolutionary because these are the ones that hold the potential or maintain our potential for existence, for continued existence. Okay? So, if you have a genetically diverse population, ibig sabihin hindi sila agad mape-perturb kasi magkakaiba sila ng, genetically diverse sila. So, when a disturbance comes, like for example, storm or some major change, you will expect that some members of the population will live because they are genetically distinct from the other members of the population. Ayan. Okay? So that is according to Michael Soleil. And so we now look at modern conservation biology. Okay? So modern conservation biology is based on conserving structural and functional aspects, okay, of important ecosystems. Ayan. So your structural components can be your plants, your animals, okay, the wind, physical conditions as well, while your functional components in the ecosystem could be the processes, the ecological processes there. You have your nutrient recycling, okay, your oxygen production, dispersal, okay. So this is the difference between your structural and your functional components. So it looks at now the diversity, the stability, okay, of ecological communities. Okay? It looks at habitat fragmentation, okay, yung pagkakawatak-watak ng mga habitats, okay, landscape ecology, because our landscapes, for example, you have your plain, you have your savanna, you have your these different morphological aspects, these 3D aspects of a certain habitat. Okay? Dahil doon, nagkakaroon din ng different communities, types of community structure there. Okay? So we look at that as well, yung ecology behind your different landscapes. You also have island biogeography, okay, or the distribution of communities, of biotic communities, depending on a certain geography, a certain feature. You have your climate, okay, you have different aspects of that certain island, of that certain place. Okay? Paano ba nadidistribute ang mga living organisms dyan? And of course, restoration ecology. Okay? According to Schaefer in 2009, protected areas actually serve as reference ecosystems. Okay, what do we mean when we say reference ecosystems? These are models, okay, for ecological restoration projects. Okay, and they serve as sources in the future, okay, of biodiversity. Okay, they are reference ecosystems. So this is the idea behind protected areas now, okay, in modern conservation biology. Okay, so in order to understand this, we have to understand first the concept of homeoresis. Okay, in order to understand what protected areas are, how they actually become reference ecosystems, bakit reference ecosystems sila. So first, we have to look at the concept of homeoresis. Ayan. So homeoresis, para siyang katumbas ng homeostasis. But it is a term to describe a dynamic system. Okay? So, di ba, ang ecosystems natin, it is very much dynamic. Ibig sabihin, lagi siyang nag-change. Okay? So, homeoresis is a property of a dynamic system to return to this particular range, to this particular trajectory, even after an external disturbance, an external perturbation, okay? Or despite continuous changes, continuous noise, continuous disturbance, okay? So para siyang homeostasis, but para sa mga ecosystems, okay? Following a major change or perturbation or disturbance, like for example, forest fire or storm, okay, ecosystems usually follow these regular patterns that are time-dependent. So they are temporal patterns and they are regular. And this phenomenon is called ecological succession. Now, ecological succession can be highly encouraged by your ecological memory. Okay, so just like us, these ecosystems have ecological memory as well. And this ecological memory is apparent, okay? It is reflected through the seeds that are left, okay? The site history, the soil fungi, okay, or soil microbiota that is left behind. You have stem fragments, perhaps, ayan. So, these can be the components that could trigger this site to remember how it was once a biologically productive habitat, okay? So, whenever we try to protect an area, when we create protected areas, we try to tap into this ecological memory, okay? So, we do this by trying to identify first the key threats to that area, okay? This is to improve the conditions of that area para mas maalala niya kung ano siya dati, okay? So, we first identify the threats, and then we try to eliminate them or reduce them as much as possible. And second, we also try to regulate the use and access of that area. Kaya siya protected. Okay? So we try to tap into the ecological memory of that area in order to encourage din yung succession, ecological succession. Ayan. So we can expect that in highly disturbed areas like the city, wherein there are a lot of introduced species, we have invasive species. Okay, these are species that are introduced and then they displace the native species in the area. With these types of areas highly disturbed, we can assume then that ecological memory is less in these areas. Okay? So, ayun. So, ecological memory is much important now because it can determine the trajectory kung ano yung magiging future ng ating ecosystem, okay? The ecosystem that has just experienced a major change, okay? And ito yung kinakailangan natin sa ating protected areas. Kaya tayo may protected areas to encourage this area to remember, especially those that are perturbed, okay? Especially those areas na heavily disturbed. These protected areas can serve as sources of ecological memory, okay? So, ecological memory is less, again, okay, in areas with high habitat loss, such as your urbanized areas, such as your cities, okay? These are highly disturbed sites, okay? And so, native ecosystems, meron pa rin, but they just occur in patches. And these patches of habitat are connected again by your corridors, okay? Ayan. So, these these native ecosystems can still serve, of course, as sources of seeds, of fruits, of pollens that can reflect the ecological memory of the place. Okay? Ayan. So, in this situation, the major ecological processes involved can be dispersal, okay, or immigration. Okay? So, ecological memory actually extends beyond the physical geography of a site, okay? And the genetic composition of populations and species. It includes the broader community. Syempre kasi, with the species composition present, it can encourage din yung symbiotic relationships, yung mga symbionts nila. And this can contribute to the survival of those species as a whole. Okay? Yan. So, for instance, we have specific mycorrhizae in the soil, okay? And this can contribute to the survival also of the vascular plants that grow there, okay? So, essentially, ecological memory has a bearing on the question of how communities come to be the way they are. Kasi through ecological memory, malalaman natin yung trajectory nung ecological succession na yon. Okay? So, it is also a major component of ecological or ecosystem resilience. Okay? Nagiging mas resilient sa perturbation ang isang area, okay, if it has greater ecological memory. Ibig sabihin, mas maraming mga remnants nung community dati, okay, before it was perturbed. Okay? And that's what we're trying to build through conservation, through these protected areas now. Okay? So, in turn, with our protected areas, we can have models now of for restoration projects. Kasi we can look at our protected areas having more ecological memory than these constantly disturbed areas. Having more ecological memory, we can look at them as models in order to restore a certain place. Okay? Ayan. So, the higher the ecological memory, the more resilient the community is as well. Okay? Kasi mas maraming natira na remnants na pwedeng pagkuhanan ng refugia, okay, ng growth, okay, ng area na yon. And through this diversity of landscapes, ayan, more species can also inhabit the area. And as more species can inhabit the area, better yung diversity ng gene pool nila. Okay, so highly diverse yung landscape, highly diverse yung species, highly diverse yung gene pool. So, mas magiging resilient na din sila. So, if we have diversity, we can somehow assume that the adaptability to the disturbances and perturbations, be it natural or man-made, is also higher. Okay? Ayan. Good example of this, okay, would be the study conducted by Nevales in 2008. Yan, and they try to study the structural changes, okay, of seagrass meadows after an oil spill. Okay? And they compared this to the area that was not affected by an oil spill. Okay? And they saw that there were major differences. Their study was done in Taklong Island National Marine Reserve, or TINMR. Okay, this is found in Guimaras. Okay? And it showed that there was a decrease nga in seagrass cover, in shoot density, okay, compared to the areas na hindi naapektuhan ng oil spill. So this oil spill, it's very much in the news before. It happened in August of 2006. Okay, and so they looked at how this oil spill affected now your seagrasses. Okay. And so we now look at conservation as a crisis discipline. Why is it considered as your crisis discipline now? And again, this was coined by Michael Soleil. Sabi niya, katulad ng pag-oopera ng taong may cancer, ganun din ang conservation. Kaya siya crisis discipline. And so, in order for us to understand this, we are going to look at the concept of biomes, okay, niches, patches. Okay? So, titingnan muna natin yun. And then, we're going to look at different types of species living in your ecosystems. You have your keystone, your umbrella, your indicator, etc. And then, we are going to look at the concept of climate change and how it affects these components now of the ecosystem. Okay? So at a global scale, species are actually adapted to their biome. Okay? So biomes, these are ecological species formations that are at an intercontinental scale. Okay? So global scale talaga. And these are defined by distinct life forms. These are defined also by characteristic structure of that area, of that landscape, and similar taxonomic diversity. Okay? So, examples of this, for the aquatic biomes, we have your coral reefs, okay? You have oceanic, pelagic, and benthic zones. You have your estuaries, your intertidal zones. So, at a global scale, halos pare-pareho sila ng structures, ng conditions, and yung taxonomic diversity. Okay? So, they are defined by distinct life forms. Terrestrially naman, you have your vegetation biomes, and these are your rainforests, okay? You have your grasslands, your savannas, coniferous, deciduous, okay? You have tundras, ayan. So, yun yung mga examples ng ating vegetation biomes. Okay? And most of the time, our vegetation biomes, they show latitudinal zones. Okay? Ayun. So, ito yung biome. So, at a smaller scale, your species are adapted to their ecological niche. Now, in urbanized places like here, like in Baguio City, native ecosystems usually just occur in patches. Okay? Hindi malaki yung area, yung coverage nila. So, they occur in patches, these native ecosystems now. And these patches can be connected by corridors. Okay? So, here in Baguio City, for those of you who have visited the place, you can have patches like your Burnham Park, okay? And then your GSIS Tree Park, just in front of the convention center. And you can have this campus, UP Baguio, as a corridor, okay? So, it tries to connect your native patches of ecosystems, okay? So, they are connected also by ecological processes like dispersal. Ayan. So, again, your species, they are much adapted at a smaller scale to their ecological niche. And in highly urbanized places like Baguio City, these native ecosystems occur in patches. Okay? And these patches may be connected by corridors. So for instance, you have your GSIS Tree Park as a patch, your Burnham Park as a patch, and your UP Baguio as a corridor. So aside from that, we also have different types of species in ecosystems. First, we have our keystone species. Now, the concept of keystone species actually began from studying predators. Okay? So specifically, this was a study made by Robert Payne, and he studied sea stars, okay, or your Pisaster ocraceus. And now he looked at how the removal of sea stars affected the community structure of that area. Okay, so sea stars prey on mussels and barnacles. So ito yung mga kinakain nila, mussels and barnacles. And specifically, yung site niya ay sa Tatoosh Island. Now, when these predators, your sea stars, your Pisaster ocraceus, they were removed from the area, these mussels proliferated to the extent na dumami sila, they crowded out the area, inagawan pa nila ng space yung ibang species like your benthic algae, ayan, and these benthic algae supported sea snails, limpets, bivalves, okay? So without your Pisaster ocraceus, without these keystone species now, biodiversity in the area, in this tidal plain, was cut in half. Okay? Another example of keystone species would be the removal of wolves. Okay? So sa Yellowstone National Park, in the 19th century, they removed wolves there because the US government feared na these wolves would heavily prey on livestock. Okay? On the elk, on the bison, on the livestock that is present there. And because of this removal, nung tinanggal nila yung mga wolves sa Yellowstone National Park, it caused major change, okay? And we call this change top-down trophic cascade. Okay? This means that there is a change in the ecosystem because of the addition or the removal of a predator. Okay? So just like there in Tatoosh Island, so just like what happened there, when P. ocraceus or Pisaster ocraceus was removed, here in your Yellowstone National Park, elk populations exploded din. And what happened? They competed for food resources kasi ang mga elk natin, they are herbivores. So talagang inubos nila yung grasses, yung reeds. And these food resources, they were not able to grow back in time to feed also other species or other animal populations in the area. And this caused a top-down trophic cascade. So that means your keystone species are now those that have this disproportionate effect to the community structure in an area. Okay? Another would be your umbrella species. Okay? So, umbrella species, these are often confused with your keystone species, but they actually differ in that this umbrella species has a wider area, has a larger area because it is migratory. Ibig sabihin, nagta-travel siya. So, in the same way, it has the same effect as your keystone species in that it also causes a top-down trophic cascade. But the main difference is that your umbrella species are migratory. So, mas malaki yung area na sinasakop nila. Mas marami yung maaapektuhan nila. Okay, so they have greater habitat needs as well and requirements. And so, this is important because when you want to protect an area and there exists there an umbrella species, you can try to consider also protecting other parts of the area. So aside from our keystone species and umbrella species, we also have what you call foundation species. Now, they play a major role. These foundation species play a major role in creating or maintaining a certain habitat. You have there your corals, you have there your seagrasses. Okay, so these are two key examples of foundation species. Okay, so corals, these are actually tiny animals. Okay, they grow as a colony, and they leave behind this skeleton. Okay, and this now makes up your coral reefs. Okay, so it takes millions and millions of years in order to create coral reefs. Okay, and these are the most biologically diverse ecosystems on the planet. Why? Kasi yung 3D structure nila iba-iba, yung mga coral reefs na to. And di ba, ang sabi natin, pag mataas yung diversity ng landscape, we can expect na magkakaroon ng different organisms that could live there. Okay? So, you have your planktons, you have crustaceans, mollusks, they can live, okay, sponges, even fishes, diba? You have different marine reptiles, they can live in the crevices, in the bulkiness of our coral reefs. Kasi talagang iba-iba yung 3D structure. Very much unique yung mga 3D structures na form ng ating coral reefs. Okay, another would be your seagrasses. So, these seagrasses, they provide breeding grounds, okay, for marine species sa intertidal zone. They also provide grazing areas for dugongs, di ba? And then, aside from that, they also, of course, provide habitat for fishes, okay? And not only that, they also sequester such large amounts of carbon dioxide, and they store it for millennia. Okay, so that means kapag nagpatayo ka ng isang resort tapos akala mo weeds lang yung seagrasses na yan, tinanggal mo sila. Of course, yung na-store nila ng carbon dioxide for millennia, this would be released. Okay? And yung nangyayaring ganon, syempre, nadidissolve yung carbon dioxide na to, it gets thrown into the ocean na naman as carbon nitrate. And this can cause acidification, which can harm life, marine life. Okay, so not only are you removing breeding ground, potential habitat, potential grazing area, you are also releasing carbon dioxide again, okay, which becomes dissolved carbon nitrate. And nitrate, di ba? So acid siya. So na-acidify pa yung ocean. Ayun. So these are your foundation species. They have an impact. They have a major role in creating or maintaining a habitat. Okay? Another, okay, so we have the keystone, we have umbrella, we have foundation. Another type of species in ecosystems would be your indicator species. Now, as the term implies, indicator, so very much sensitive sila to the environment, to the changes in the environment. And so, being very much sensitive to changes occurring in the ecosystem, okay, these can be our warning, okay, early warning, okay, na may habitat na nagsasuffer. Okay, so they can be used as to give us early warning na that habitat is suffering. Okay, kasi they are very sensitive to the changes happening in the ecosystem. Okay? So, these changes can be your water pollution, air pollution, di ba? Climate change. Ayan. So, these may be changes associated to those things. Okay? And these indicator species are affected immediately by these changes. So, a good example of this is our oysters in Chesapeake Bay. So ito, they act to filter nutrients, diba? Sediments and pollutants in the bay. And so, these oyster beds, they actually protect fisheries and coastal habitats as well. So, that means that the health of these oysters, of oyster populations here, can be a reflection of the health also of the entire ecosystem there. Okay? They can be used to understand the health of the ecosystem in Chesapeake Bay. So this is in US. Okay? So we can use oysters as indicator species. Yan. So lastly that I would like to tackle is your flagship species. Okay? So, itong mga flagship species, sila yung pinakasikat, okay, sa mga species, and they act as symbols, okay, for environmental habitat for that environmental habitat, for certain movements, for certain campaigns. Kasi sikat sila, okay? So, they can be used as mascots. Okay? So, yun yung ating flagship species. Examples of those would be your panda. Yan. So, yung panda natin, as seen in WWF or your World Wildlife Fund, diba? It's one of the most familiar flagship species that is a global symbol. Pandas are global symbols for endangered species. Okay? Kaya din siya gamit ng ating WWF. Another would be your polar bear. So, sila naman yung symbols naman for climate change. Okay? So, di ba? So, they are used as a flagship species associated with climate change. So, ito yung examples naman ng ating flagship species. So, they have a popular appeal, okay, to the public. Ayan. So, yun yung ating flagship species. Okay?